So it may have seemed a little rude, but I decided last week to sort of say hello this week. Since I knew I was going to be preaching, so I thought, well, we'll be saving time if I just do my thank yous now. Because I'm very grateful to be invited to come back to you all and to be here for a season of time, for the Lent season. It's clearly that, God must have discussed it with Amy and decided that he's not going to survive Lent by himself out there in Iowa. We better bring him back here. So that's why I'm here, and I'm sure it's to be able to have a Lenten experience with you. And my wife would have been here, but she is actually having a theatrical experience. She's just begun rehearsals for a role in an Iowa stage play that actually runs all the way through Holy Week itself. So I'm also grateful, an opportunity to be grateful for that big four big boxes of wine that arrived at my house after my last stay with you all. And you'll be glad to know I have not finished all 47 bottles. In fact, I'm on a pace that probably will take me to next Lent and so on. But what I really enjoy is the fact that so many of you either wrote on the bottle or put a little tag around the bottle. So when I take one, and it's always what's it going to be? And I take one, and then I see your name, and so I always drink to your health, but it's a kind of a way of praying. And as I was saying at 8 o'clock, my prayers get much more fervent the further down the bottle I go. So, about a week last Friday, we began. The initial reason for coming was to sort of be with the vestry for a retreat. I was blessed to sort of be a curate of a rector who was doing his doctor of ministry in preparation of vestries for leadership for a year, in a congregation, and his priority for him was that the vestry get to know each other better in terms of their personal lives. For him, it was a question of if you can build that trust of the members that are engaged, then have to engage. Then when they have to engage in conversations that might reveal their differences of opinion, somewhere that trust can hold them together and stop them going too far in making things personal. That it really helped to recognize as the person that's holding out for the gray paint for the hallway, the battleship gray paint for the hallway, is really still a child of God, just as you are. And you can, if you want to say there, by the grace of God go I, you could, but in terms of one's taste for paint. But it really was helpful, he thought. So for him, it was important that the first almost half of a vestry retreat was taken up with those stories. And last week we met as vestry and staff. The staff came together as well over dinner and began that process of storytelling. And particularly along the lines of when did and how did God get your attention? The staff continued the retreat both on Saturday and then on Sunday afternoon and Saturday afternoon, and the vestry will be doing it on Holy Saturday, a very significant day. There's a book called Failure by Bishop Emma Einson. It's a book that's very difficult to carry with boldness through the airport, I have to tell you. You just don't somehow want people to know that you're a failure. And I in fact got overlooked by the steward for the drinks when they came down. And the person next to me sort of said, "Oh, they missed you." And so I just then revealed the book I was reading and said, "It may be because I'm reading this." And there was the big title, Failure, across the front of the book. But she talks about Holy Saturday as a day in between the Good Friday and Easter morning. They don't know about Easter morning. They're just soaking in all the events of that terrible evening and that day. And what can they do? They can do nothing but wait. We don't know even where they were in terms of relationship with each other, whether everybody was in the same place, because they'd scattered. So Holy Saturday just stays there for us as a day of waiting. And Bishop Einstein surmises what would it be to be a church of Holy Saturday. A church that doesn't assume that they know what God is going to do next, but actually develops an ability to trust and to wait. And that in that process of discernment, often failures play their part. The acceptance of failure, the failure of Good Friday, was looming over the disciples as they waited. They waited in the shadow of a failure, and of course it turned out to be God's great way of victory. So Holy Saturday is when we're gathering, and I hope that may have an impact upon what we do. It's important to get to know one another. You know, some of us come to faith quite suddenly and with great, maybe even fanfares. Some of us profess that it was gradual, that we've always felt like we've believed. Some of us may even profess never to have known what it is, never to have fully known an encounter with God. They're still in process of working all this out. I had a senior warden, his name was Ted, and he was such a big part, a patriarch, an Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob of the Church of St. Barnabas in Eagle Rock, that when he did retire fully from being senior warden and not running for any more terms, we actually made him emeritus senior warden. But he would say in these storytelling times that he had never ever had what he would call a numinous experience. He'd never known a revelation of God, or even perhaps been able to recognize the presence of God, except he said, when he beheld the face of Mary in the Pietà. That was a moment, he said, maybe there. And yet this was the most holy man you could ever meet. A man, a servant, and we would never let things pass he was the extra step for decision making, not because he was a controlling person, but because he was a wise person. Truly the elder of the congregation. And we knew to sort of wait for his sort of buy-in to whatever it was we were doing. And it was like, the one thing about Ted was that his faith had been refined in a rather unusual place. His relationship with God had been refined in Stalag 4, which was a prison camp of the Germans in the World War II. Ted had been shot down over the Adriatic Sea in came ashore in northern Italy. And he said there the Gestapo were to greet him. And yet he said, and the Gestapo, all I have to say about them is that the ones you see on TV are not half as horrible as the ones in real life. And God didn't appear to him in a cell. But here he was 50 years later, having gone through all of that. 50 years later, in the same place where he had been baptized at the age of 4, serving as humbly and as gently as ever. Ted would have never claimed to have been born again, I don't think. I don't think he would have claimed that. But I'm convinced that he's seen the kingdom and is seeing the kingdom of heaven. It's a real shame, isn't it, that we've created of this phrase, born above or born from above or born again, that we've created this kind of like membership card that one has to have and a certain experience you have to be able to be a member of God's club. And that's not really how it is. Certainly wasn't that for Ted. So what is all this about? What is the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus about? Where does Jacob fit in, and where do we fit in? Where does our experience of God fit in to all of this? It was when we asked at the vestry meetings, when did Jesus become more than a word to you, that people like Ted would say, I really don't know. I really don't know. He couldn't say when, he couldn't say how. But it was clear to all of us that Jesus was more than a word to him. And I think it's what God seeks for all of us. It's what God sought for Jacob, who was on the run. Jacob was on the run. Jacob is not a very nice character. If you know the story, he had he was a twin, but he was the smooth one, and his brother Esau was the hairy one. And they were, and Esau, having been born first, even as a twin, was the one to inherit the birthright of his father Isaac. And so Jacob contrived with his mother of a way to steal that birthright from Esau, and somehow God just seems to have been involved in this in some way or another. Jacob knew that Esau was out for revenge. His mother knew that, and his mother got him to set off and go off on this journey, and that's where we meet him in the midst of one of his journey. He didn't deserve God to be looking out for him, but God was looking out for him. As he camped down for the night, we read that he has a dream, and in this dream sees a stairway that's going up into heaven with messengers from God who travel up and down. And then God speaks to him and assures him that because he had received this birthright by whatever means it was, assured him of God's presence for the generations to come, and that Jacob stood in the very promises that God had made to Abraham and to Isaac and now to Jacob. Jacob will be part of that divine promise to Abraham, a patriarch of God's people. His very name will be changed from Jacob the supplanter to Israel, a name that then would be carried forth by the very people that came from his out of his generation. Now, I'm not going to debate the character of Jacob or how God kind of seemed to use and embrace that. There is, however, no greater example to sort of prove or show what Paul is talking about in Romans, about this righteousness that comes by faith, this act of grace that is not ever earned or deserved. But it's always while we're yet sinners that Christ dies for us. It's always when we're, not because we're perfect, not because we strive well, but while we're sinners, Christ dies for us. And the invitation of the life of Jacob, the invitation even of Jesus to Nicodemus, is an invitation that all of us have nevertheless to embrace. And that's one of responding, of accepting this offer of grace as ours to handle. And that's what I think where Jesus even was wanting to take Nicodemus. Being born again is about starting over, becoming conscious of God's presence in this world and not being ashamed of it, and to carry with that presence the recognition that there's a promise that the people of God will be reconcilers of all people to the love of God and to love one with another. It's a shame that we ever made this phrase a membership card for the special club of the chosen. But I've been there. I've done that. I've pigeonholed some people and asked them if they're born again and waited judgmentally for their response. And I even got into it with my mother. My mother and I would have long there were more arguments than there were debates, but because I was so pleading with her to be born again, to sort of make this decision that was a here and now, immediate now decision, because I thought the consequences were just unbearable to think about, to not see the kingdom of heaven. I felt I had to convince everyone about this. And both of us would often end in tears. Until I began to wonder a bit, and I began to sort of come across other traditions of the Christian faith. I was kind of early in the days of faith at that point, but I began to wonder, began to get involved in the traditions of others, particularly the Catholic tradition of which we are part. And I realized that liturgical people enter faith by baptism, and often as infants, without a knowledge, without an awareness of anything that was going on. And I thought to myself, hadn't my parents actually provided that for me? Didn't they have me baptized? Yeah, they may have said they had me done, but they had me baptized. And my aunt was my godmother, and so on and so forth. And eventually, after I'd done some work as a Methodist lay preacher, done some work in an Anglican church in Bucharest that didn't have a priest, with the bishop's permission, the bishop came a-calling one day, and he said, well, shouldn't we get you confirmed? Shouldn't we get you confirmed? And so one Friday afternoon, I think it's the 9th of September if I remember my certificate, one Friday afternoon, over lunch, in a church in Kensington, St. Mary Abbots, there was the bishop, and there was the rector or the prebendary of the church, and myself, and me. And we gathered for confirmation. I didn't think anything was going to happen. It was just going to be a formality, tick off the canonical box that says I can be a lay reader in the Church of England if I'm confirmed. But boy, the bishop laid his hands on, and the windows, the stained glass windows, kind of came alive. They weren't singing or anything, but they were just alive. And the connection with the statues of the various saints that were around suddenly were kind of were my people. And I realized that this faith of Christianity had a part of it that was so historical and so long, and so many parts, so many communities. But it wasn't about me, it was about we. It was about all of us, and all these different ways that God makes connection with us, creating this community of faith. And my discussion with my mother even began to change. It shifted with it. It was about embracing the family into which she had brought me in baptism and embracing it more for herself. And what I didn't know and what I only learned later was after my father died, and my mother said to me, started going to church. And she said, I would never have done anything to embarrass your father. And your father came from a working class family, and Church of England was too much for him. And he once said to me when and my wife added to it too, that, nail lad, we're chapel, not church, he once said to me. Can't see you in skirts. But all of this was too much for my dad. He came to it, and he sort of supported me, I realized, in my ministry in different ways. He would once say at a time of real sort of discernment or confusion, he said to me, well, there's someone, lad, who looks after your life. He could see it. And I'm sure he's with Ted, even to this day. But whether he had that born again, I don't know. If it happened in a different way than it happened to the likes of me. And at 82, my mother engaged the church of the priest who did my dad's funeral. 8 years later, when she died, it was during COVID, and only 10 of us could go to the crematorium from the church where she had the service. And there was a band of about 20, because only 30 could be in that kind of service. So there was a band of 20 people who up to 8 years ago she had never known, but were her church, her family of God. And they all stood around outside the church, kind of waved us off as we went with the hearse to the crematorium. We don't know most half of it, do we? We don't know what God is working and doing in the lives of those around us and of each other, perhaps. Jacob needed the dream of God's presence, and so he embraced that place and the generations of the chosen that became his family. So what I want to say today is that it may not be that it's a dream by which God catches your attention, but it will be something. I know it's something. Maybe this very liturgy that you enjoy this day may be simply something that we all will do in the course of this morning. Stretching out your hand and letting someone place in your hand the body of Christ given for you. All of the divinity of God that you can bear and hold in the simple palm of your hand. Being able to acknowledge that is what it means to be born again. It's what it means to have something that is of spirit, being recognized by spirit. One of the commentators said about Nicodemus coming at night, that maybe that's all that Jesus was saying to him. But you've come to me at night because you're afraid to come in the day. You're afraid to own the faith that you have. You're afraid to own it and own it publicly. Own it even to yourself. In a way, you're still in the womb, comfortable and quiet and private and in the dark. You're still at night. You must be born again. Just like you in the flesh, you allowed that moment to come when you had to break free of the womb in which you were growing and make the rest of your life in the fullness of the light. So in spirit, so let that spirit side of you also be free and come into the light. And maybe it will take all of that hard and sweat and pain of labor to happen. Danish theologian Kierkegaard says we don't ever come to faith except there's got to be a leap. There has to be we actually have to leave the ground. A little leaving of the ground to embrace this great presence of God who calls us and who brings us into existence as God's beloved children. Of course, we all received life because we're here. We all received life. We all at one point submitted to the law of nature and our time being now. And here we are. But I think God says to us today, this God who so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. God says to us all, now is our time as well. Our time to embrace life of the Spirit that is given to us. Embrace it as a public witness to the loving grace of God, who has not abandoned this world, no matter how things may seem right now, but actually is in us and among us, very much present to this world, and very much because of God's presence in you, is full of promise. Full of promise. Amen.